I am a human being and I killed human beings.
Before I knew it, I'd fired 4 shots at the door. I kept on shouting for Eva to phone the police.
Tests are underway to determine if a serial killer is on the loose in Centurion, Pretoria.
The dead won't bother you. It's the living you gotta worry about.
In South Africa, 71 people are murdered every day. These are the stories of the criminals and the people who hunt them. My name is Paul Llewellyn. I'm a journalist and a filmmaker curious about Africa's killers, criminals, and the cops who catch them. Joining me to discuss crime on the continent is Gerard Labuschagne, the former cop and current head of LNS Threat Management, who led the investigative psychology section of the South African Police Service from 2001 until 2016. In his time there, he worked on over 300 serial murder and rape cases, and he is the Profiler. Please visit our YouTube page and do subscribe. Simply search Profiler Africa, and we're available on all your favorite streaming platforms: iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Do listen and do share. We are going to be our big push is consistency. So we're going to be dropping new episodes every week now, because that's what we want to do and that's what we need to do, and we feel terrible that we haven't been doing it up to now. Anyway, Gerard, how do you feel about the fact that we started off with 57 murders a day on the podcast, and now we're up to 71 murders a day in South Africa?
Well, obviously it's not good. I mean, 57, 58 was already tragic in terms of the statistics, the number per 100,000. And it's, gone up significantly to, into the 70s. So I think essentially it shows that, we're not successfully combating this particular type of crime. So whenever a crime starts to flourish, very often a large reason why is because law enforcement is not capable at combating it effectively, letting people know that if you do this, you're probably going to sit for a long time in jail. That's pretty good deterrence for a lot of people to not commit crime.
Knowledge is power, and hopefully here with the podcast we can keep informing you as to kind of what some of the ins and outs are of the justice system in South Africa and where some of the strengths and weaknesses are. It is a shame to see those statistics going in a direction that is not preferable. Let's go back to 2013, Gerard. My previous business partner, and may he rest in peace, because unfortunately we lost him to COVID, but he was a member of the Sisulu family, and it meant that when we did work shooting stuff, we would often shoot around official things. We'd shoot official things. Now, when Madiba passed away in 2013, I had the opportunity to film behind the scenes at Mandela's house while when all the mourners were coming through, etc. And then we went and we filmed at his funeral, which took place at F&B Stadium. Now, I always bring this up because, Gerard, what happened on that day was, I woke up in the morning, I was put in a car, and I was kind of bypassed all of the security at F&B Stadium. I was never once, this is my point basically, I got in a car, we drove a van full of gear. It was camera gear, lights, camera, action. At no point were we checked by security at all. I drove with a police escort from Randburg through to F&B Stadium, ushered right through into the underground parking at F&B Stadium. We parked maybe 30 meters away from where Barack Obama was the president at the time, where his famous limousines were parked.
The Beast is what it's known.
The Beasts. There were a number of them, 3 of them in a line, in fact. And I got to take a photo standing right in front of it, and then I was standing in the reception area to the to F&B Stadium. And can I tell you, within the space of about 10 minutes, everyone, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Prime Minister of the Barack and Michelle came wandering past. We had Rob Mugabe was there. We had Angela Merkel was there, all in one room. And I was within touching distance of all of these world leaders at some point within this period, for the funeral. And can I tell you, I did not get security checked once. We could have driven a van full of whatever into the F&B Stadium that day, I could have been armed to the teeth, Gerard. Okay? I would have been able to I could have taken out, okay, a very large chunk of some of the world's most important leaders. I shouldn't be saying this on a podcast. I'm not saying I want to. I'm not saying I would plan to or I ever thought I was going to. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because today we're discussing a dude. Had he been in my situation on that day, it would have been bad. Am I correct to say that? It would have been bad.
Yes.
Start us off.
Yes.
Tell us where
yes
does the
and no,
story
but I don't want to
start?
give too much away. So yeah, essentially the backstory to this particular case, I was still in the police. It's 2013, and Barack Obama came to South Africa twice in 2013. June, July, he was doing a sort of a whistle-stop tour through various countries throughout Africa. He went to Senegal, Pretoria, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Tanzania. For just literally from the 28th of June to the 1st of July. So literally like 3 days in and out. I mean, these things are very quick, very well planned, etc. And around that time, on the 17th of July, and the American embassy gets an email from a man from the little town of Batuli in the Free State. And this is, again, think about it, it's 16 days after that Barack had left his African visit. Remember, his last stop wasn't in South Africa, it was Tanzania. And he sent a message saying to the consulate with his name, from his real email, with a contact number and everything, and his address, saying, when your president was in the country, I set out to kill him because I felt I could reasonably get away with it. I want to explain to you why I thought this was the case. Wild weather happened to disable the attack, and the moment passed. But the plan was going to be in 3 phases. First, kill him in the consulate in Cape Town, on American ground, and to surrender to the Secret Service. Second, stand trial in the US for his murder, and then to prove to an American court that American law effectively excuses the assassination of a president. And thirdly, I wanted to offer the American government an alternative to this toxic precedent that makes it possible to kill a president and to claim immunity. The American founding fathers, in other words, the George Washingtons, that crowd, whom you venerate, terminated the lawful government of an American head of state, King George III. That was sort of the American Revolution. He may have been King of England, but he was primarily, as far as the American system was concerned, also the King of America. The founding fathers, by striking down their own king's presence in America, in direct breach of their oath of allegiance to him, effectively wrote into American law that it was permissible to rise up against the lawful American government and to strike it down. That's, in a nutshell, what he sent off to the consulate.
I mean, he's thought about this now. He's thought it through.
Yeah.
Like any good conspiracy theorist would.
And then it kind of goes on to speak about, kings have no, queens have no standing of authority, referring to that then Queen Elizabeth, who was still alive at that point, and he could become King of America, et cetera, et cetera.
We'll talk about her crimes on another podcast because it's about time we get that stuff. We get a whole bunch of stuff back. We must talk about that. The looting of the historical looting of South Africa. Maybe there's a podcast in that anyway. Carry on.
So what did this achieve? Well, someone from the consulate in Johannesburg did call him to say, hey, did you send this email? And he said, well, yes, I did. And they said, well, we'd like to speak to you. And he said, well, I'd love to speak to you guys because I have a very important message I need to convey to you. And they said, well, can you come up to Johannesburg? And he said, well, no, I can't because I don't have money. I'm kind of stuck in Batuli, but, you're more than welcome to come and visit me. And that was kind of the end of it. And he didn't hear from them again. He said he was so surprised that he actually got a reaction that he didn't even get the person's name. But that was kind of it for him. And then he thought,
how do Americans take this kind of thing? Because I imagine this was not taken lightly and or would you imagine that they would get a bunch of this kind of stuff? Or what is the response from the local embassy when this kind of thing happens?
Well, in terms of procedure, they're supposed to notify the police, which they did, crime intelligence, which they did, and then crime intelligence is supposed to look into this matter and investigate, which they didn't.
Okay.
But the American president daily gets threats, direct, indirect, on various social media platforms, emails sent directly to whatever, that the U.S. Secret Service, which is tasked with protecting the president, has one of the most sophisticated and advanced threat assessment, or they call it protective intelligence systems in the world. And if you go on YouTube and Google how to protect the American president, I mean, they will go, if they know he's going to, New York, they will, before he goes there, everything is calculated, worked out. Everybody who's ever made a threat against him who lives in New York, they literally place a guard, a Secret Service agent outside of their house, to monitor them. They'll visit them and say in the next day or two, you're not going to do anything, you're going to stay in your home. They have a massive protective system in place to prevent things happening. So this they would have looked at, but I don't think they would have looked at it and seen it as not being too serious. Also, at that point in time, he says this is sent after he's gone back to the US. So for them, it would probably be more of an issue if Barack was coming back to South Africa again, because this guy would be on the Secret Service's radar.
Yes.
So,
of course, that immense system did not cover Paul and his film crew on the day of Nelson Mandela's funeral.
Look, there were a few other things on that day, which we'll get to at the end of the presentation, and that might explain why.
Okay.
So we jump forward to 8th of December, where he sends his second letter. We know on the 5th of December 2013, Nelson Mandela sadly passes away. They had scheduled his memorial service at the FNB Stadium in Soweto for the 10th of December. So technically it wasn't his funeral, it was a memorial, and his funeral was going to take place in Qunu thereafter. But I mean, that stadium was full, and as you pointed out, I mean, world lead. I mean, I have a list here, 50 heads of state. We had Obama, obviously, Clinton, Bush, Jimmy Carter, David Cameron from the UK, Ban Ki-moon, I think he was the head of the UN at the time, Raul Castro, royalty from the Netherlands, Spain. I mean, even the Spice Girls were there. So it was, I don't think, besides an actual gathering at the UN, which is only active world leaders. I mean, this had active and, all past. I mean, it was really, if you wanted to do the world a lot of damage in one go,
this was my point. And I drove a Quantum without getting checked by one security guard from Randburg straight into FNB Stadium.
Absolutely.
I'm hopping on about this. I'm going to shut up.
So this guy sends the next letter on the 8th of December. So remember, he passed away, Mandela, on the 5th. The memorial was to be on the 10th. He sends his letter on the 8th to, again, the consulate. And essentially it says, allow me to present the scenario. A competent hunter like me can take off a man's head at 300 meters without a scope. A desperate man like me with a failing business has nothing to lose, no wife, no children, no prospects as a white man in a black-controlled country, no money. A tactical man like me could believe he would get away with it by striking the president, not fleeing the scene, surrendering to the Secret Service, face charges in the trial of the century, get a lawyer to represent me. And then he goes back to this issue of the founding fathers of the U.S., violently killed off the lawful American government of King George at the time, in other words, a British monarch, by basically with the revolution kicking the Brits out. And that sets a precedence that anybody who basically kills a president can then step in and say, hi, I'm in charge now, and this you've set a legal precedence because you kicked out the British monarchy. So you've set the precedence that a violent revolution is acceptable in your system, because that's how you came to form the modern American government, is by kicking out the previous lawful government, so to speak, etc. And he says, my fee for helping you understand this would be, $100,000 payable by the 11th of December. And then again, he gave his name, his phone number, his address, his bank account details, etc.
I trust that reason may prevail and tensions may be resolved without bloodshed. And then he gives his bank details.
Yep.
Okay.
But he makes a date of when they have to pay this money the day after the funeral. And Barack Obama arrived and departed on the same day. So again, like the first one was intentionally sent 16 days after Barack went back, this had a date that actually you wouldn't be able to go ahead with killing him if they didn't pay, because that date would already be after.
Yes.
So he did later admit he got the dates kind of wrong.
Okay.
So where is Batuli? For those of you that don't know, as I said, it's kind of like if you're traveling down to Cape Town on the N1, it's just off the N1, probably, 100 and something kilometers after you pass by Bloemfontein. So I'd never been there before. There's not much there. It's surrounded by farm area.
A lot of time for thinking in Batuli, clearly.
Exactly. Sort of a quaint little, tiny little town. Like even the petrol station is like sort of not paved. It's sort of dirt, except where the actual pumps are. It's a really one-horse town. This is kind of a picture of Batuli when you look up the definition of one-horse town in South Africa.
Well, he was a milkman, so I mean, they even still had a milkman.
So I mean, he basically ran a little tiny shop. Well, his dad ran it, and he helped his dad. His dad was quite elderly, and they basically, farmers would come and deliver milk in these, big containers, and they would, go and deliver orders to guest houses. You could walk there with your little container and get some fresh milk. Okay. So I wouldn't even call it a dairy. It was literally a milk shop. And who was our suspect? Because remember, this was not a whodunit. We knew from the start because he's given his details. And that often for me, when you have these bizarre statements, it's kind of like, it's usually the mentally ill people who do give their names and details because they don't realize that what they're doing is really wrong. So anyway, so who is our man? And our man was Sean Fruin, and this, I can say this because it was the substance of a criminal case and his details are out there. And this case is also in my book in much more detail, and I did contact him beforehand to just tell him this is what I was doing, what's his thought on the matter, and he was okay with it. So Sean at the time was 47 years old, so he was an olderish guy. I mean, not that 47 is old, but he wasn't a young man. Never been married, South African citizen. Had completed high school, had previously for a short stint been a journalist after he completed high school, but really couldn't cope with the pressures of life. And kind of whenever he would start to do well in his employment, kind of like had a bit of a breakdown and withdrew. So essentially he'd been staying in Batuli with his elderly father for countless years and really just running this little milk shop with his dad, looking after his dad. He was a very loyal son. He'd been in the army, as many white South African males had been back in the 80s. Nothing particular that he did in the army. University for 2 weeks because it was too much pressure for him. No violent history, no substance history, and no previous treatment for any mental health issues. So really an ordinary, very plain ordinary guy, even in his appearance. Looks not like almost, I guess, what you might be imagining in your head when you read these sort of ranting and raving letters, but actually quite a nice guy, to be honest with you, when I finally got to meet him. So I get called in because Crimes Against the State get asked to look into this. And they weren't called in because of letter number 2 that had literally been a day or two before I go down to Batuli. Finally, it had been passed on. The first letter from July was what the police were reacting to. So it had literally taken the police
just coincidence
5 months to actually get their butts. Maybe because of the pending visit by Barack Obama that they thought, ooh, maybe we should go down and check this guy out. I don't know. But quite horrific that SAPS's response to this. If anything, on a diplomatic level, you want to make it look like you're really, cooperating.
Crossed your T's and dotted your I's with any kind of little loopholes that could become a problem.
That for me was quite shocking that they'd really done nothing in 5 months. Until it was given to this detective from Crimes Against the State, who did a great job, and he's the one that sort of called me in. So I did get the opportunity to speak to Sean for about, I think, 2 hours. And he was very cooperative because he wanted people to come and speak to him. So this is one of those bizarre situations where the threat was not real. The threat was intended to get people's attention. And it'll become more clear in a moment when I go into it. So for years, since the 80s, he had this sort of philosophical viewpoint that democracy is a weak form of government. That South Africa is in a crisis, remember this was 2013, under the ANC as it had been under the nationalist government. And he says the reason being is because a monarchy is the only successful form of government. And he said, look at all the examples of monarchies and they always work well. If you do that, you'll actually realize that they don't really work well.
Yeah, until your head ends up on a spike in the palace.
Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. A lot of historical governments have been monarchies, and really, no. But anyway, that's his.
A big part. It does speak to maybe a more Caucasian version of reality in South Africa, because if you're of any other racial persuasion, then monarchy, colonialism, imperialism, these are not things that you have a happy history with or a happy memory of.
So he felt, as I said, that the monarchy is the only good form of government, and that Queen Elizabeth, as you know, she just passed away, was removed as queen because she had no legal standing to be queen. Then we could undo South Africa becoming its own independent country and go back, I suppose, essentially to be a colony of the monarchy.
Okay.
And undo that contract of 1961, as he described it, that led to the creation of the Republic of South Africa. Now, his argument why the Queen is not legitimate is that the Bible only speaks of kings and not queens, which, again, I'm not the most religious person, but I'm sure that's also not right. And because there's no legal standing for queens to rule countries, and the Queen of England is the head of the English Church, she can't be, which also means she can't be the Queen then. Therefore, we can get rid of her. Prince Philip, at that point, remember this is 2013, would then become king, and he could undo anything that she ever did because she would have had no legitimacy. So that's his twisted philosophical argument that he's been trying to convey to people.
When it comes to conspiracies or what have you, or whatever you want to call this, though, the Bible is a kind of a go-to because it's whatever you want it to be.
And you select and cherry pick phrases that suit you.
Exactly.
So then he said, but imagine the powerful powerhouse South Africa and the UK would be. But then he kind of said, there's a similar departure in America because, like we said, we could undo all of that, and USA, UK, South Africa, one effective, consortium of countries, under the control of the king. And wouldn't that be amazing?
Why wouldn't he look closer to home, though? I mean, we got plenty kings, you know what I mean? What about a Zulu king? I mean, why can't he just be a little bit more patriotic?
Yeah. So that was and he'd been trying to tell this to people for years. He contacted the head of the Church of England. He sent them an email to their info@ address. He contacted well-known lawyers in America, sent them emails. And of course, just literally nobody was responding to them because they all thought this guy's a bit kooky.
Yes.
To put it politely. And he was getting frustrated because he thought we could fix so many things. We could fix our country, the world. People are dying because the world's in a terrible state and the country's in a terrible state. So he almost felt it became his mission and his duty to try and save the lives of people in South Africa and other parts of the world because he had the solution, but nobody's listening to him. So if you think about that way, you can perhaps imagine his desperation in his mind that, but guys, there's a solution, listen to me. And nobody is.
So how do I get attention? Me, the little guy, the white guy, and a little torpie in South Africa is going to threaten the first black president of America's life.
So he even did publish
Again,
books.
Just feels so typical.
If you go onto Amazon, you can actually find 2 books that he self-published. You can't get them anymore; they're not available. But 2 books that he published about this whole issue.
Cool.
So he was trying to various, I guess you could say, socially acceptable avenues for years to get people to go, my goodness, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We need to fix this loophole, or we need to take advantage of this loophole. And he'd even started to email, because the Church of England, he even then, after Church of England ignored him, he contacted MI5, the British Secret Service. And they, of course, didn't respond. Then he thought, okay, look, I have to get desperate now because desperate times, desperate measures, nobody's listening to me. I've been polite. I've been contacting all the people I think would have just sat up and said, wow, yes. So he decides, maybe if I threaten violence, people will pay attention. So he actually created a website he said he made it under an obscure name, and it's like the Mountbatten Army, it's a guerrilla army, and he said, great, now we've got a fake army. We have to make some kind of a threat. He said, great, under my guidance, I get permission to kill all bishops, under the, my order, blah, 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 blah. And then he contacted MI5 again and said, hey guys, look at this really weird website. Maybe you should contact the person who wrote it. And they still didn't. And he thought, well, wow, what do I have to do? I'm threatening and nobody's even paying attention to me. And that's when he started, okay, I'm going to send more, direct threats. And now, of course, Barack Obama's coming to South Africa.
And he's getting the attention that he desired.
But sadly, he's getting the wrong kind of attention because, of course, he's committing criminal acts.
Exactly.
You could argue this is terrorism.
Very serious criminal
But
acts.
he did, and again, method to his madness, because he wanted someone to come and speak to him, and the police came down, and me included in that, along with my colleague, Colonel De Lange, did go and interview him. And we said to him, do you mind if we video record this? And he said, yes. I don't mind because I know you're going to give it to the Secret Service. And the Secret Service is going to show it to Barack Obama, which, of course, Barack Obama didn't even know about this threat and will not ever know about 99.9% of the threats because there are so many of them.
Yeah.
They're not going to bother him every day with whoever the president is with these notifications.
Yes.
But it did get to the Secret Service. So, destructive logic in his madness, so to speak. And I was very grateful. It's a fascinating video, and I use it for training of psychologists when it's appropriate to do so. And he's very cooperative, but I said, I actually kind of liked Sean. He's a nice guy, interesting. He's the kind of guy that if you were in a pub one night having a few beers and you started chatting to him and he told you this philosophy about, but the Brits the Americans kicked out the British government at the time in the 1776 or whenever it was. Doesn't that mean that it's okay to do that? Wouldn't that be a legal argument in court if you then decide to have a revolution against the government and say, sorry, we're now in charge. You guys did it before. You can't complain now. Well, you might go for a minute or two going, yeah, I wonder about that. I wonder how they closed that loophole. And after a while, you might go, no, hang on a minute, this is a bit kooky.
Well, exactly. I mean, this then speaks to the point that, yes, it can make for an interesting bar conversation. And, yeah, you can kind of pontificate about what might or might not occur. But what's going on with this guy that he is... what mentally there's obviously something at play here. What is that?
Yeah, and the thing is, he's very well spoken. I mean, for the short stint, he was a journalist. He's very well educated. In that sense, he comes across as a very smart, and he is smart, educated person, which sometimes makes you listen a bit longer than you would have if this person didn't sound so smart. So,
well, absolutely. Sometimes just the ability to present an argument, whether what you're presenting is rational or is irrational, can come off as convincing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people that are convinced by non-truth in the world that we live in now. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, especially in the media mix that we have today, you can kind of speak any non-fact into reality as long as,
Look at Donald Trump. He's very good at it.
Exactly. It just takes an audience.
And also look at how many even more weird conspiracy theories have been thrown about over the past 2 or 3 years in society about COVID, about this, about that.
Absolutely.
Does this sound more or less? I think it sounds a lot less weird than those conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
So obviously, as I get down, then myself and Yanni interview him, I realize he has some mental health challenges. That this is delusional thinking. It's fixed false belief. You can't argue with it. It's been around for a long time. It's causing problems for him in his life. He's been arrested by the cops. So my recommendation was that this guy should be sent off for mental observation in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, which is ultimately where he went. An investigating officer, Clippys van Heerden, was very good. I mean, you could have been very hard-handed and just treated this guy like a terrorist.
Yeah.
But he actually realized the guy has a problem. That's potentially why he called myself down to come and get involved in the case, and was very sort of gentle with him. And that's kind of like what you'd like to think when a law enforcement official deals with someone who might have some mental issues, that they don't ridicule them, treat them as they would a normal criminal, that they treat them very decent. And he actually said, Sean, I spoke to him at the end of December last year, I said, he really is appreciative how Captain van Heerden treated him, that he was very kind and decent. And that was nice to hear. So I kind of look at this case overall as a big success. Whereas our other cases we discussed, someone's dead. That's not a success in any sense, but we can maybe bring justice. But this one, in a way, we prevented problems. We helped someone. It's kind of like a win-win. That's why I like threat assessment, because this is really what it's about.
Yeah, and I think what's nice about this case as well, we often talk about murder and rape and what have you. It's nice to get a sense of the kind of breadth of stuff that you've been involved with and you've had to deal with over the course of your career.
And I would almost say this is one of the changing cases for me about changing the direction of my career into the world of threat assessment, is because I just felt so much more rewarded by the outcome. Is that nobody got hurt. We were able to pick up a guy who needed help. He got the help he needed. And when I checked in with him, as I said, December last year, which was 10 years since this incident, things were going well in his life. So that was really kind of just kind of made me feel positive about this kind of work.
Yeah. Look, I mean, the whole concept of threat assessment is something which, you just wish that it was more pervasive across all kind of law and disorder kind of problems that we have. Because if you think about the case we discussed last week, and you think about how much threat there was to assess
On Andrea
in the
Venter,
course of the build-up to her murder, to Andrea's
Yeah, and
murder.
if that people had been looking at through threat assessment eyes and just doing their job, that would have been told differently.
Well, if the police system had threat assessment kind of built into it, it's not the Tom Cruise future crime type concept, but it is that thing of there are identifiers when it comes to, there are things that you can identify which predict potential future problems.
And even in this case, if the police had acted sooner, Sean wouldn't have got round to doing the second threat, which got him, again, it just made his troubles a little bit more from a legal perspective, and he could have gotten help sooner. But the question often people say to me, but, would this guy have done something? So this is where the threat assessment angle comes into it, because saying someone is mentally ill is part of threat assessment.
Which is a great next question. Would this guy have done anything?
No. Let me explain why. Firstly, we look at his ability to implement the plan. Was there the emotions behind the threat? And if I'm angry with you and I say, I'm going to murder you, or whatever, my emotions are matching the verbal, then there's a potential that could happen, unless I cool down. Take away the emotion, I'm probably not going to go ahead with the action. He didn't have any issue with Barack Obama per se. He wasn't angry with Barack for his stance on Iraq or this or that, or for fake promises that he says the person made that he didn't act upon. He had no emotional investment in Barack Obama. This threats were just a tool to try and get the attention of people to come listen to the message he had to say. And once they heard the message, he was convinced people were going to go, oh my goodness, thank you for bringing this message to our attention. We forgive you for the threats that you used to get our ear. But, what your message you've helped us prevent catastrophe taking place in our country because somebody else could have exploited this loophole or whatever the case may be. And that was his view, that I would be forgiven once people heard what I was trying to say. They're just not hearing my message. They don't quite get it, or they're just not getting to the right people. So maybe this is the way to get my true message about the monarchy, etc., to the right people. So there was not that emotional investment in the threat. He didn't know Johannesburg nor Pretoria, and of course that Barack Obama was up here in Johannesburg for the memorial. He had no verbalization of a plan of how to get to where Obama was supposed to be. I mean, the car that he had was dilapidated. It wouldn't even have made it as far as Bloemfontein. He didn't have money. I probably didn't even have the money for the petrol, let alone to buy a ticket. And then he had no support when he gets to Johannesburg, where to go. He hates crowds. That's why he lives in a tiny little town of Batuli, because he can't handle the pressure of the big city. He got the dates wrong of Obama's visit. His letter says by the 11th he must have paid me this money. He felt using money would be an enhancer to get people's attention. But Barack was in and out the country on the 10th. So he didn't have the proper intelligence. He said he thought for some reason that the memorial, and he thought, and he got the memorial and the funeral kind of mixed up. He had no indications. He had done some searching to see anything about the visit, where exactly the routes, how would it happen. Sometimes you come across these things in the media. He had no special weapons training. He had no, as I said, not the financial means. Joburg was 700 kilometers away from where he lived. The closest commercial airport was 185 kilometers in Bloemfontein. As I said, he doesn't like crowds. Even in terms of weapons, he didn't start to collect the tools necessary, to actually commit this act. And secondly, the FNB Stadium, borrowing the example you said, to get in there and hide with a gun, well, I don't know, maybe it's easier than we thought it wouldn't have been.
I could have had a trench coat on, and I could have been, like I say, I could have looked like I was in a Hollywood movie.
You did go there with the police escort. Maybe that sort of perhaps,
Yeah, but they didn't check. They didn't check our bags. They didn't have dogs come out. I've been in these situations where, I've shot at the president's house in Pretoria.
Film, not shooting.
Sorry,
a gun.
filmed. I filmed at the president's house in Pretoria. And before we were allowed into the house, we had to lay out all our gear, and the dogs come and they sniff all the stuff, and then, to make sure that, they didn't find the weed either, but anyway, I'm good at hiding that.
You can just delete that part.
Let's delete that part.
So then, of course, weapons access. To do this, you need to have the tools. He had an old .22 rifle and an unlicensed .22 pistol that he inherited from his mother that was just never licensed into his name. So I'm not saying a .22 isn't dangerous, but trying to snipe someone from a faraway distance, not the best option. So there was nothing that really...
There was no threat.
Essentially.
Really,
did he have a grievance with Barack Obama?
Assessment.
No. He didn't actually have a grievance about the system that he's referring to. He just said, this is a great system, but there's a potential loophole that other people could exploit it and cause havoc.
Yes.
You know, he had no actual violent per se ideation. He was expressing violence, but no backing, but this is actually how I feel. He didn't do any research and planning for the visit, the target, etc. He didn't prepare travel arrangements, his vehicle, fill it up, get this, you know, nothing of that nature. He didn't try to go to the FNB stadium beforehand in the days before to try and see, get the lay of the land, you know, can I get over a fence maybe and into the access? Nothing that shows prepping.
So what does this mean for what ultimately happens to him?
So essentially, obviously he was initially charged because at that point the police can't not charge him. If there's going to be mental health issues, that has to be first investigated by the relevant experts. So they did charge him for his threats he made. He was then sent off based on a recommendation from me that he goes to, in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, to Bloemfontein to get an assessment. He was there, I think, for 30 days where they said he does have a diagnosis and that, I just want to get it to exactly, that he does have a delusional disorder, which is exactly what was my concerns based on what he was saying. Mm-hmm. And he then was there for, I think, about 9-10 months, and then he was released back into the care of his father. And as I said, then I didn't really hear about him. I mean, I had no reason. I'd left the police, you know, almost not too long after that. And it was only really when I wanted to consider this as a chapter in my book that I then contacted him. And, you know, as I said, things were actually going quite well with him. His father had passed away. He's still in Batuli, and he's kind of like, he says he kind of doesn't know why back then, all those years, this issue was so important to him. He says he hardly ever thinks about it nowadays. He says he did feel that the mental health treatment really helped, and that's why he was quite happy that I would publish a chapter, because he said as long as the message goes out there that getting help helps.
Yes.
Go to speak to people, listen to them, whether it be psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. He said then he's quite happy that, you know, the chapter goes out, and I sent it to him before I finished it, that he could just make sure it was factually correct, and if there's any specific things that he didn't want me to sort of put in the books, and he didn't. He just said, look, there's one thing I said somebody was his step brother, and actually it's his real brother, or vice versa. But he said the rest of it is fine.
And interestingly, what I like about I've got your presentation open that you do on this case, and then you have the image at the end of Barack Obama with the famous sign language. If we all remember back, there was a sign language interpreter standing with Barack Obama who couldn't do sign language. What people may not realize is...
Actually, he had a diagnosis, and this is again public information, so I'm not revealing confidential stuff. He had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He had been previously charged with murder and made, I think if I recall correctly, made a state's patient. And of course, he couldn't do sign language. So within literally a meter of some of the world's leaders, you had a guy who had a severe mental health issue and a violence issue. Mm. And I asked the Secret Service one, I said, but guys, you guys have this most amazing system set up. He says, how come that? And he said, the problem is they cannot vet. If the other government is in charge of organizing sign language people, caterers, they have to assume that that country has done the proper vetting on those people. They can't vet the appointees of a different country. And hence they couldn't vet the sign language interpreter to see and find out that he had actually this history. So, I mean, that's just so on the South African side, that was just complete PR disaster, let alone potential, harm to, I mean, imagine that. Imagine this guy. And he's actually said in one of his interviews, because he did quite a few interviews after this incident, where he said at that moment in time, I was having voices, I was very scared, I wasn't, well, that's not exactly what you don't want to be hearing when this person is standing right next to anybody, let alone a world leader. Yeah. So, you look here, but, you don't, you're looking in the wrong place. In a way, they were looking at Sean, who actually wasn't a danger.
Yes.
Whereas you're having a guy right there who was potentially a danger.
Yeah. And only took them 6 months to get to that letter in the first place. Yeah.
There's actually quite a funny Jimmy Kimmel who did an excerpt on his show about this, and they actually brought in a real sign language interpreter to actually interpret what the guy is saying. And if you go and Google Jimmy Kimmel and sign language interpreter, you'll probably find it. And it's quite, I mean, this is gibberish, nonsensical.
It's certainly interesting, though, that the American government is going to kind of just assume that the proper security checks have been done by the folks in the country that they're going into. I'm quite surprised that that's the case because, hey, I mean, you can imagine not having faith in some countries that you go into
Exactly.
that are where maybe even. Yeah, I'm not saying South Africa's backward. I mean, we have a pretty good system, but there are certainly cracks.
And you could argue, but no, he died. That organizers clearly everything regarding Mandela's death had been planned years before.
Yes.
Governments. I mean, it's not like, hey guys, we've got to be in South Africa 2 days' time because Mandela passed away. Every government had worked on its contingency plan to prep for the day Mandela dies.
Yes.
The stadium was decided upon years ago, so that when it happens, it's just a case of, right, implement plan Mandela. So it's not as if we suddenly scrambling to find interpreters and there wasn't time to vet. No, that's not an explanation.
Yeah, I agree with you. There certainly wasn't time, but I can pretty much guarantee you that there were definitely other places, other folks, non-South Africa, that were more prepared for Mandela's death and funeral than the South Africans were, because I was around the memorial. I went down to the Eastern Cape for the funeral, and as is pretty typical in these kinds of things, it was not a seamless bureaucracy that you were dealing with that was easy to navigate as a media person. It was kind of controlled chaos from what I kind of remember it to be.
Plan doesn't also mean the plan's going to go down well on the day.
No, exactly. All right, so that's this case. Have you had any other similar kinds of incidences in your career where you've had people making threats that one would need to be worried about? Just in passing, how in this day and age where there's so much more access to media and to the means to be able to to say crazy shit and to throw crazy conspiracies or plans out into the world, you'd think that there were more and more of these types of cases.
Absolutely. I mean, people, you say, you can be upset right now about something, and it's very easy to fire off something on Twitter, email. You have access to, you can Google someone quickly and find an email address at a work, etc., and fire off things on social media that in the, 15 years ago, by the time you manage to get the pen and paper out to write the little letter you want to send to someone and post it, the emotion's gone and you're no longer angry. So it is easier, which means you do get a lot more threats. But we still always say that each threat has to be assessed. You can't just assume. Yes. That one email you're seeing, you might not realize is part of 20 emails that have been sent to a few other people in the organization, or there's a long history. You're just seeing one out of 20. So we always say that each threat has to be investigated. So for sure, we've had other very worrying threats that are being sent by email or other communication styles that you do definitely get a lot more worried about. And of course, part of the threat assessment is trying to understand the person behind the threat, which if it's anonymous, you're limited to what's contained in the threat. If you are, like in this case, able to find out something about that individual, you're able to give a far more informed understanding. If someone has said, Paul, I'm going to kill you because I don't like this documentary you made, imagine that coming from a person who has 5 previous convictions for assault. Then I'd say, well, I'd be a bit more concerned about that threat than if it was sent by another person who doesn't have that history of assault, or the person lives in Canada, or the person is in a wheelchair. So those same words can have a completely different meaning and threat level depending on those very same words coming from who. And it's understanding the who which really puts you in a position to understand how worried we actually be.
A schizophrenic who's previously been charged with murder is not a guy that should be standing next to Barack Obama.
True. So if he had sent these emails, then I would be.
Where is Sean on his conspiracy now?
So basically, he doesn't. Well, he said to me he doesn't ascribe to these beliefs anymore. He says if he reflects back, he can't understand why it was so much of an issue for him back then. But he says he doesn't think about it. He's not worried about it. It's just like a non-issue for him anymore, which I suppose is great, because that hopefully means that the treatment that he had and maybe is still receiving did what it's supposed to do, which was help ameliorate those sort of delusional beliefs.
Yeah. Would he be on medication? There's a chance that he would have what kind of treatment regime? It would be counseling with meds potentially?
Yeah, so definitely at the time he would have been given medication. Now, I mean, I didn't want to go into that question and ask him, but delusions are just very difficult in general to get rid of, specifically paranoid ones. They often make people not very treatment compliant. I wouldn't say he was per se paranoid, so I think that's a great situation for him. So it would have been medication definitely in the beginning, but which could have been tapered off as they wanted to see how he does. The thoughts have gone, psychotherapy. I don't know where he is, how easy it is for him to access state-appointed psychologists. I don't think he would have the funds to access his own, and I don't even know if there is a psychologist in Batuli. So it might still now be medication, or he might have been weaned off of it if the doctors were happy with his progress.
And the police's current kind of ability to identify and to deal with these kinds of threats?
The advantage in this particular case is that Captain van Heerden, who called us into this case, he actually used to work in the same building as me for most of my years in the police. So he knew exactly who we were, what we did. So we had been called in to quite a few of similar kind of cases that seemed to land on his table. And I think actually his supervisors gave him all these kind of cases. Although he says he hated these things. He doesn't like this psychology cock. He just likes a straightforward criminal. But he was very good with these cases. So whether it's Karma that brought him more or his supervisors that brought him more, he knew how to deal with them. And we'd worked on quite a number of cases where we had delusional people sending threats to do things, etc., prior to this one. So again, like many things, it almost was, who do you know?
Yeah.
Whereas if this landed on a different detective's table and he didn't even know that my old unit in the police existed, it might have been dealt with less finesse. He probably would have realized there's something wrong with the guy and either recommended that he be sent, or it would have gone to the point where it lands on the prosecutor's table and the prosecutor goes, oh, but this guy sounds a bit wacky. Maybe we should get him observed. Or his lawyer eventually might say, my client isn't mentally healthy. He should be observed. But, here we were able to pretty much take him straight to that psychiatric facility for the 30-day observation. So he didn't have to go sit. He might have spent the night in the local police station cells, which in Batuli is not, anything tragic. But in another case, this guy could have ended up sitting awaiting trial for months before A, this issue was raised by someone, or B, there was a bed available if it was in, say, Johannesburg, where the Sterkfontein waiting list is very long. So, and then you have a guy who really shouldn't be in a prison environment, and that's not good.
Exactly. It's another example of one of those cases which seem to be the majority of cases that we end up discussing, which is a case that just happened to land in the right person's lap. The lottery that is kind of law enforcement, whether or not this kind of lands with a cop who has some sensibility or has a deep enough knowledge to know how to deal with this particular case appropriately.
But I do think people like him, who's working in the crimes against the state unit, are probably, you could argue every cop should have some kind of insight into mental health issues, because, your street cops are going to come across these people in the street, and this guy's coming across an investigation. But I do think when you're tasked with investigating threats to senior members of the government, to foreign dignitaries, all those cops should definitely be getting a case study like this presented to them, a bit of more depth and insight into this kind of mental health issues and how these play out in a criminal environment that he might come across someone.
There's what's the point of great advances in your field if we are not applying this understanding and this increased knowledge to how we tackle crime now and into the future? Threat assessment, sounds to me, does need to start to become an inherent part of what we do, because so much crime, there is a threat. There are threats in the build-up to to something really tragic happening.
If anything, in the domestic violence environment, those detectives should be trained in threat assessment so they can understand I'm dealing with a case. Although the crimes themselves are perhaps relatively minor, the case is actually quite serious because this is a guy on the edge of doing something that's going to be lethal.
And so much of law enforcement needs to be about mental health, identifying and understanding how to deal with people who have mental health issues.
And not waiting for something to become so bad that there now is a serious crime committed. Oh, and then as a cop, I step in.
Exactly.
What about crime prevention? And this is essentially crime prevention if it's done properly.
Yeah, and is there anywhere in the world that is kind of getting to that is kind of tackling this kind of level of sophistication when it...
I would say that probably some of the Canadian law enforcement,
Oh, really?
they have stalking units, for example, who understand these issues or are trained in threat assessment and realize that you need to react quickly if it's a stalking victim who's phoning the cops based on a protection order. So I would say probably the Canadians. There could be others, but I mean, obviously haven't interacted with all of these agencies, law enforcement agencies throughout the world.
Yeah, and if you need any threat assessment done in South Africa, you can get it done. Just phone LNS Threat Management, Gerard's company, because this is what you do, threat management, isn't it? All right, well, another great case, Gerard. Thank you very much. What is your ultimate takeout from this particular case?
I think, like we've touched on, that threat assessment is a viable way of firstly figuring out what you're dealing with, how worried you should be. But most importantly for me, threat assessment is about preventing things from getting to the point, from the thing we're worried about happening, from actually happening, because you intervene. Getting that person treatment, it's about preventing the worry from realizing. And that's what I like about it, because it's not waiting for a crime to happen and then just trying to bring some sense of justice. But the victims already had the harm done to them. This is done in its right way, is about, if you pick these things up early enough, you're preventing that guy from doing something bad, which is good for him or her. You're getting them whatever interventions they need, which is good for him or her, but that's also good for society. It's a far more long-term solution than just getting a protection order saying, don't you do that. That doesn't change the person's state of mind, their emotions, their anxieties, their fears, their source of anger, which sometimes might even be a justified source of anger, like getting a 50,000 rand electricity bill from the city council. That's not your real bill, and you're frustrated and stressed out, and your electricity's cut off, and you're unemployed, and fixing that problem suddenly reduces that person's risk. So it's often about, helping the individual, fixing the problem if there's a genuine issue that needs to be fixed, and making everybody safe and happy. How can that be a lose?
Yes, but it's one thing to be able to discuss these things hypothetically in the kind of in the perfect world or the better world that we imagine. Unfortunately, so much of what we discuss indicates how far we are from having a tangible conversation that's actually results in real change and actually fixes some of the issues that we have. Okay, Gerard. Well, a good case that kind of illuminates the concept of threat assessment, I think. A guy that found himself on the police's radar, but who, under evaluation, was not really a tangible threat as such, but even despite displaying the certain threatening behaviors. I just hope that in the future, threat assessment, can become just more ingrained into the system of law and order that surrounds us. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks.